extremely excited and honored to introduce to you Jason Puckett. Jason Puckett is the librarian for communication and educational technologies at Georgia State University in Atlanta. He is also a 2010 Library Journal mover and shaker. He writes and speaks about open source software in libraries, digital rights management, and teaching information literacy. He podcasts at Adventures in Library Instruction, and he also blogs at LibrarianX. Jason is the author of a forthcoming book about using and teaching the open source reference manager Zotero, forthcoming in the spring of 2011 from ACRL Publications. It's really, again, my pleasure and honor now to turn the microphone over to Jason, and let's give him a warm welcome this morning. Jason, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Buffy. If somebody could just type in chat, let me know my audio is okay. I'm going to continue talking. First of all, let me thank you. Okay, great, thanks. Let me thank Buffy for the very warm introduction. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Buffy, Sarah, and Pat for inviting me today. I'm very excited to be speaking today. And thanks, Tessa, for assisting on the technical side. I really appreciate it. Thanks very much. Please do feel free to just type in questions as I go into the chat box. Some of them I may try and answer as I'm talking. Otherwise, we'll catch them at the end. I'm worried about trying to answer too many questions as I go because I tend to talk too much rather than too little. I'm sure Sarah can vouch for that. Don't bother using the raise hand feature during my presentation. Just type questions into the chat, and I'm totally fine with that. So there we go, slides. Let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I am not a programmer. I am not a systems librarian. I'm a reference and instruction librarian. So as far as software is concerned, I'm an enthusiastic amateur. I'm not a professional systems librarian or programmer in any way. So why am I particularly interested in open source software? Well, some of my favorite software tools that I use daily, and as Buffy said that I'm writing a book about, are open source software. And so, as I said, I'm a very enthusiastic user of open source software. I'm writing a book about Zotero, which is an open source research tool. If you've ever had a conversation with me about anything, you probably have heard about Zotero. I'm really fascinated by the fact that the internet makes it possible for us to create and distribute software that does amazing things for free. I just find that really interesting and fascinating. I also think that the open source software movement's mission of sharing information for free is one that librarians should recognize. I think people and organizations who create open source software are on our side, if you will, and that's something we should be aware of and that we should advocate for. And also, I really like free stuff, and I want to tell you about some of my favorite free stuff that you can get on the internet. So what I want to cover today is I'm going to start just with no assumptions that you have any knowledge about this stuff at all, and I wanted to talk about what is open source software, what's good, what's bad about it, why does it matter to us as librarians and as users of libraries. And I want to, maybe for sort of the second half, I want to give some examples of open source software that libraries are using. And I think I probably have about 35 minutes or so of material there. And I hope to leave some time at the end for questions and answers. Okay, so what is open source software? Let's talk real basically here. One definition you can get from the URL that's on my slide there, from the Open Source Software, the Open Source Software Foundation, I think is what that is. Basically, let me talk about what I mean when I say open source, as I will be saying a lot during this presentation. When programmers sit down to create a piece of software program, they write what is called source code. This is the raw material, the ingredients, the actual programming instructions that make software work. When that's finished, it gets turned into a file that you can download and run on your computer. You'll hear that called the executable file sometimes. That's the finished product that you download and run on your computer or on your server. Open source software means that the source code is available openly for free for anybody to download, to examine, and to alter. It would be like if you went to a restaurant and ordered a meal, and when they serve you food, they also give you the recipe along with it. That's the source code. Now, companies like Microsoft, like Apple, like many, many other commercial software companies don't release the source code for their software. They just release the finished product that you can download or buy on a CD or a DVD. By altering the source, or by examining the source code of a program, you can learn how it works. By altering it, you can change the way it works. So for example, if you don't like the way Internet Explorer works, you can't really do anything about it. You can, other than change browsers. If you don't like the way Firefox works, you can, if you're a programmer, take a look at the source code and find a way to make improvements to it. In other words, you can look at the recipe, you can change the recipe, and you can bake a new version of the program. This has implications for non-programmers as well, and I'll talk some about what those are as I go along. So I've been talking about sort of how programmers work with it, but this has implications for us as I assume, mostly non-programmers. Open source software is also called free software, and I'm going to talk about some of what we mean by the word free, because the word free has some ambiguous meanings in the English language. So first of all, you'll hear the phrase free as in beer. This means just simply without cost. Gratis, you'll hear used as a synonym for this, or gratis if you're a francophone. So this is a pretty simple concept. If you're my friend and you like me, you can buy me a beer, encourage this behavior, and it doesn't cost me anything. This is one of the characteristics of open source software. It doesn't define it. But one of the characteristics of open source software is it is free as in beer. It's gratis. It doesn't cost you anything. Now, there is free software out there. You may hear the term freeware. This was sort of an early term that got used a lot. You don't hear it as much anymore. But there is still freeware out there. Google Docs is freeware. It doesn't cost us anything, but we don't have the source code to it. iTunes is freeware. There are hundreds, thousands of programs out there that are free as in beer, but not open source. Now, why do people give this stuff away? Well, really for the same reason that universities publish scholarship, to share information. This is a public good. This is a worthwhile endeavor for human beings to engage in, is to create information and to share it. This is the same reason that libraries provide free information to the public. This is a worthwhile public good. Open source projects may be sponsored by a nonprofit organization that funds them. They may be funded by donations. They may not be funded at all. They may be completely just provided by volunteers. Sometimes individuals will just join together on an ad hoc basis and create open source software. There's a concept called gift culture or gift economy. This a term from anthropology. The URL that's on there is by an article by Eric Raymond, who writes extensively about open source software. And if you're interested in this, you will want to take a look at his book, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which you can find just by Googling it. But in this article, Homesteading the Noosphere, he talks about this idea of gift culture or gift economy and how it applies to open source software. What this means is that there are cultures in which what you give away determines your social status. And he talks about the fact that by contributing to open source projects, programmers can gain prestige. They give away their time and their energy, and they gain prestige, which really is not a surprising concept if you think about it. It's really a feather in the cap of an open source programmer if they can say, oh yes, I've contributed code to WordPress, I've contributed code to Firefox that made it into the final version. So that's really not such a surprising or alien concept. Now, why is free as in beer important to understanding open source software? Why is this an important concept? Well, this is fairly obvious. Free is good. We all like free stuff. On the individual level, I tell students when I'm teaching them Zotero, for example, you don't need to buy this product. You can just download it for free, install it on your computer. We don't have a site license for GSU. You can just take it with you if you graduate, which is not the case with some of our commercial products like EndNote, for example. This is also obvious benefits for library budgets. We don't have to pay for Zotero. We do pay a great deal of money for EndNote licenses every year. We don't have to pay for Zotero. Now, there are drawbacks to that, which I'll talk about in just a moment, too, when I get to free as in kittens. Let me talk next about free as in speech. Libra is the term that we'll use as a synonym for this sometimes. This is a little bit more complicated to explain. Everybody understands free as in beer. I give you this, and you don't have to pay for it. Free as in speech, there's a link there to the Free Software Foundation definition of free as in speech. What this means, I'll summarize it. You can run the program for any purpose you want. Microsoft loves to tell us what we can and can't do with their software. Free software, open source software, you can run the program for any purpose you want. You can study how it works, you can change it, you have access to the source code. That's what free as in speech means. And you can redistribute the software and any changes that you make to it. If your library's programmers make changes to a piece of open source software, you can upload your own customized version and redistribute that. Now, why does this matter? Producers of commercial software, non-free software, non-open source software have a vested interest in locking users into their own proprietary formats. That's a quote from Trevor Owens from Center for History and New Media, which I'll talk about a little more when I talk about Zotero. They have a vested interest in locking users into their own formats. If you use a piece of commercial software, chances are very good that the data that you create using that software is going to be locked into that program. You won't be able to import and export it to and from other programs quite so easily because they want you to keep buying new versions of their own software. Open source software, I'm generalizing here, but generally speaking, open source software is designed on open standards to import and export data from other programs very easily. If you're using WordPress, you can import and export to and from other blog software fairly easily, for example. Another benefit to having the source code open is that it tends to, again I'm generalizing a bit, but open source software tends to have very frequent upgrades and improvements. You'll hear the phrase, "to many eyes all bugs are shallow," if you read about open source software at all. What that means is that by opening up the software, anybody can look at it. Bugs tend to get stepped on pretty quickly. Security holes tend to get fixed pretty quickly because so many people are able to examine the workings of this software. Another benefit to free as in speech, the shareable aspect of open source software, is that it's not dependent on a single entity to develop a piece of software. If an organization that's sponsoring an open source project decides to shut down or they lose their funding, somebody else could pick up the source code for a piece of software and start developing it on their own. And in fact, this happens all the time with open source software, not because development stops on a piece of software, but just because people decide to take it in a different direction. This is called forking. One version of a program will continue and somebody else picks up the source code for a program and starts developing a different version with different features, which is really interesting. Now, there are sometimes drawbacks to free software. We call this free as in kittens, the open source concept of free as in kittens. This is the third kind of free that I'm going to talk about. That's Calvin there on the right of my slide. Calvin lives at my house. Calvin didn't cost me anything up front. Calvin has not been free in the long term. Calvin has cost me a fair amount of money, a fair amount of time, a fair amount of energy. Among other things, he eats upholstery. So the slipcover of the sofa that he's sitting on in that picture is no longer with us. Yeah, Karen, same, free as in puppies, free as in speech. Excuse me, free as in puppies, free as in kittens. Those are synonyms there. Yes, Sarah's right. Calvin is the devil. never mind, I don't want to get into Calvin stories, but the idea here is that the fact that you don't pay anything for a piece of software doesn't mean that it's free in the long term. It generally doesn't come with tech support when you take on a piece of open source software. If I pay for software, I can probably call a tech support number and get somebody to help me, to advise me with problems that I'm having. Generally speaking, open source software doesn't include that. So you'll be taking on some of your own tech support. You'll be taking on some of your own staff's time and energy to install a piece of open source software. Now, these are things you'll need to think about. The cost in staff time, the cost in energy, the cost in potential problems that you'll need to handle yourself. Is there support available? Can you install it without your IT department getting involved? Will they install something that's permanent beta? Will they take on a piece of open source software? Now at GSU, we've been very fortunate. We have a terrific IT department that has been very willing to tackle open source programs, and I've been very grateful to them with my work on Zotero, for example. Yes, Cliff among them. Thank you, Cliff. So just to bear in mind, I don't want to linger on this too long, but open source doesn't always mean better. Commercial doesn't always mean more expensive, because you're going to have to factor in time, energy, taking on your own tech support stuff. Now, is open source software worth it even if you have to support it yourself? Maybe. Frequently, to my mind, the answer is frequently yes. We do a lot of our own tech support anyway in libraries. When you have a user come to the reference desk with an EndNote question, you don't call EndNote tech support. You make your best effort to tackle it yourself. We do a lot of that anyway, and anybody who has worked a service desk in a library knows that already. I feel that by solving our own problems with software, we learn a lot more about how the tools work. I've learned a lot about WordPress and Zotero just by using them myself, by installing them myself, by using them myself, and by helping people use them. And also, open source software frequently has a very active community involved that's as good or better as commercial tech support, in my experience. The various support forums and discussion forums centered around open source software, really frequently I can find the answer to any question that I ask has often been answered before I've asked it. Okay, so for part two, I guess it's part two coming up here, I want to talk about some specific examples of open source software that libraries are using. Now, you're probably already using some open source programs that you don't realize are open source already, and these are a few common ones that I'll run down quickly that we're using at GSU and that you may be using in your own libraries as well. Excuse me, let me grab a sip of water before I tackle this one. Okay, so WordPress is open source. This is probably the most widely used blog software in the world. If you have a blog in your library, if you're probably using WordPress as well. Click the green check mark if you're using WordPress for your library blog. I know we're using it at GSU. I'm just curious. This isn't a scientific poll, but I think probably most people who have blogs for their library are using WordPress. This is designed to be extensible by third parties. What I mean by that is it's specifically designed so that third parties can create plugins for it. There are thousands of plugins for WordPress that can change and alter its features. I know we're using a lot of them in our library that Cliff has installed for us. Firefox is the second most popular or most used browser on the web, second only to Internet Explorer, which comes with Windows, so that's really saying something. Again, it's designed to be extensible by third parties. It's really designed so that people can create plugins for it. I'll talk about a couple of the plugins for Firefox that are also open source. Most web designers that I've talked to consider Firefox to be a superior browser because it is more standard compliance. Again, open source software tends to be very concerned with being compliant with open standards as well, and most web designers that I know really prefer Firefox to Internet Explorer because it's more compliant. MediaWiki, that's my chalkboard picture there. I didn't use screenshots for everything. MediaWiki is the software that Wikipedia runs on, and if you've ever used Wikipedia, you've seen an example of a website that runs on MediaWiki. We use it for our intranet, for our internal website that the public doesn't see, that anybody in our library can add or edit content on. It's very easy to use. It's not just software that you can use for Wikipedia. I know a lot of other libraries are using it for other purposes, like creating research guides, for example. It's basically a very easy to use open source content management system, as well as being a wiki. The feather there is representative of Apache Web Server, which is the most widely used web server software on the web since 1996. So for 14 years now, it has been the most widely used web server on the internet. Your web server probably runs on Apache. You may not know it, but it probably does. And the Pigeon there on the right is representative of the Pigeon chat client. Who uses Pigeon? I've used Pigeon for years. If you are in a library that uses the Library Help virtual reference software, you're probably using the Pigeon chat software. Most Library Help librarians that I've talked to have been using Pigeon. It's used by many libraries for chat reference. It's designed to interact with many chat networks. It's one program that you can log into Google Chat and AIM and Yahoo Chat and so on. Again, it's built on open standards, so it's designed to interact with many, many different chat networks, and it's very handy. And it also works on any operating system. That's the case for many open source most open source programs are designed to work with multiple operating systems. So next I want to talk about some open source software that you might not be using yet, but that I've seen used in Georgia libraries. So recently, or a few months ago now, I guess it was, I was on the Lost in the Stacks radio program at Georgia Tech. I was invited over and interviewed over there. And I went over to the Georgia Tech radio station. I don't know if Charlie Bennett and Amit Doshi are in this session, but they have previously presented about Lost in the Stacks radio show. I went over there to be interviewed and walked into a very professional Georgia Tech radio station, sat down, and Charlie opened up his recording software, which I was very surprised to see was this program Audacity. And I was like, Charlie, I use Audacity for my dinky little podcast. I figured you would be using something a lot more, high-end than this little open source program. And he's like, no, man, we use Audacity all the time. It's great. Audacity is free audio editing software. I've used it in podcasting for many years now. I do maybe somebody could paste in the URL for my Adventures in Library Instruction podcast. Let me plug that there. But we've used Audacity for producing adventure in library instruction for a couple of years now, and I've used it for many, many other audio projects in the past. It's a little bit harder, thank you, Sarah. It's a little bit harder to learn than GarageBand. I recommend GarageBand for Mac, but that's not free. Audacity is free. Again, it runs on any operating system, and just terrific if you're doing any kind of audio production in your library. I can't recommend it highly enough. This is LiveX, another program that I am a fan of. It is produced by Virginia Tech University libraries. It's a little hard to describe in a nutshell what LiveX does because it does so many things. It's really, I call it a search and discovery tool. There's a screenshot out of it. You can see that it adds the top arrow, it adds a search box to your web browser, and the bottom arrow is pointing to a Georgia State University library icon inside an Amazon web page. What happens when you install LiveX is that it adds library tools to your web browser. what it allows you to do is, the search box there is pretty obvious. You can customize a toolbar for your own library, and you can see on the left side of my screenshot there it says LiveX GSU. This is the GSU edition, of course, that I've got installed. There is a Galileo toolbar, a Galileo version of LiveX as well. That's the second link there that's customized to work with Galileo resources for our Georgia folks in the audience. You can set it to search your library catalog, your databases, your journal, your SFX article journal search tool. I'm coming up with a blank on the term there. And the other thing that it does, which is really cool, is it actually rewrites web pages on the fly as you display them. So if you're on a website that's got a citation in it, Amazon is a great example, but also New York Times Review of Books, Google Scholar, it will actually add links to the web pages as they display in your browser that will link back to your library resources. This is really cool. It works with Firefox, and it now works with Internet Explorer as well. The Internet Explorer was sort of a long time coming because Internet Explorer is not open source, and it took the LiveX programmers longer to figure out how to make it work. Okay, Zotero. Again, if you've ever had a conversation with me, you know that Zotero is one of my favorite programs ever. I'm writing a book about it, about how to use it and how to teach it in libraries. And what it is, if you're not familiar with Zotero, is if you've ever used EndNote or RefWorks, it's an open source equivalent to those programs. I say equivalent, but I think it's really superior to both of those programs from what I've seen. It's created by the Center for History and New Media at George Mason University in Virginia that I mentioned briefly earlier. It's created by academic researchers for researchers. They wanted an alternative to expensive, difficult commercial reference managers that was easy to use, easy to install. It installs in the web browser. At the moment, it only works with Firefox, but it will be working with other web browsers later on. And it provides you a space to save citations as you do research. It's built on open standards. Again, it imports and exports from other citation managers like RefWorks, like EndNote, very easily. And because it's open source software, users have been able to contribute localization help. What that means is basically translating it into other languages. So it's available in dozens of languages. If you want to know more about Zotero, I've got a link to my research guide, or the URL for my research guide up there. I have also open sourced my research guide, if you will, by publishing it under a Creative Commons license, so you feel free to copy it for your own libraries as well. I'll talk more about Zotero anytime you want me to. Really, just email me. Okay, I don't know if we have, is there anybody from Emory in the room today? This is from an open source project that was created in the state. This is created by Emory Libraries. It's called Reserves Direct, and this is a complete free open source reserve system. This is developed by librarians and library programmers at Emory University. It allows users and library staff to upload and manage files. You can set it, depending on your library's needs, you can set it up as self-service, where your users manage their own files completely, or as full service, where the library staff manages everything. There's a demo available. If you go to reservesdirect.org/demo, you can create an account for yourself and log in and try it out for yourself. This is kind of an interesting case because I'm not sure what the development status of this is. I was hoping that there might be somebody in the room from Emory who could comment on this. According to their website, this was last updated over a year ago in May 2009, but it's kind of an interesting case because this is one of those situations where, because it's open source, if another library wanted to tackle this and take this on, they could download it, give it to their programmers, and start adding new features. Okay, so yeah, they have no current plans to continue development of it. I think basically that the programmers who developed this have moved on to other jobs. But again, it's perfectly workable software as it is. You would just need to freeze in kittens to have your own IT staff be prepared to support it and potentially add new features. And I didn't use a screenshot for this one. I got a little tired of the screenshot, so I chose Green Lanterns for Evergreen here. Some of you in the room, I guarantee, know a lot more about Evergreen than I do, so maybe if there's interest in discussion about that, other people can talk about that after in the Q&A part. What Evergreen is an open source ILS that's developed by Pines, which is a consortium of 51 Georgia public library systems. Essentially, I talked to a friend of mine who worked on this, still does work on this. Basically, they found no commercial integrated library system that met their needs and developed their own. And they really had to think a lot about the free as in kittens concept here. They shifted their budget from licenses for commercial software to the support and the infrastructure needs for developing this. There are according to their website, there are 544 libraries that are now running this open source ILS. There are 275 in Georgia, but a lot more in Canada, Michigan, Indiana, other states, elsewhere in the United States. There are 20 libraries in India that are planning to come online in the near future running on Evergreen. The interesting thing is the more libraries that use this software, the larger the development community becomes and the more ideas and improvements that can potentially happen. The more people that are using this and working on it, the more potential developers there are for this software, which is really, to me, the bottom line of what makes open source software really cool and really interesting. The more people that use it, the more people that are sharing the information, the better it becomes and the more improvements can potentially happen to it. So finally, I don't know if anybody is using this on their own desktops, but I want to talk about a couple of open source programs, and I say programs that are really bigger than a single program, but open source tools that I use at home and to some extent that I use in my work as well. And I want to talk about just briefly about OpenOffice and about Linux. OpenOffice is a complete free Office suite compatible with Microsoft Office. It comes with a word processor, which is the screenshot on the left in the background there, is OpenOffice Writer, which is the word processor. It's also got a spreadsheet tool. It's got a presentation tool, and so on and so forth, that are all compatible with their Microsoft equivalents. I'm writing my book, at least half of my book is being written on the OpenOffice Writer program. It runs on any operating system. If you're comfortable using Word, you'll be comfortable using the OpenOffice word processor. They are really very, very similar. They've been deployed by a lot of governments, state governments. A lot of local governments are using OpenOffice to save money on Microsoft licenses, which can get very, very expensive. On the right is a screenshot of a Linux desktop. The link that I've got there, ubuntu.com, is just one of the many versions of Linux that are out there. Remember I said that because they're open source, anybody can pick it up and make a new version. There are, I think, probably dozens of versions of Linux. Ubuntu, I think, is maybe the most user-friendly to install and to use. What this is a complete free operating system. You can start with a blank hard drive. Instead of installing Windows or installing Mac OS, you can install Linux, not spend a penny on the operating system for your computer. Small libraries can and do put Linux on public workstations to save money on software licenses. If all you ever use is the web browser, which is what many public workstation users are doing in libraries, you will never notice the difference between Linux and another operating system. In fact, a friend of mine online, a medical librarian, has customized their Linux workstations to look and behave exactly like Windows, so that if you sit down and use it, you would never know that you're using a non-Windows operating system. He's even got a little start menu icon, and he's customized the OpenOffice icon so that they say Word and Excel instead of OpenOffice. So I'm going to conclude there. I did pretty well. I came in at 40 minutes. That's about what I was shooting for. I found that I really could not watch the chat window for questions as I was talking and keep up with my notes at the same time. So we'll take a few minutes and take questions. And Sarah and Buffy, I don't know how we want to, if you want to paste in questions in the chat window, or do you want to, okay, that's great. Dana asked, are there any stats and studies out there on the long-term stability of modern open source projects, as well as maintenance and training costs of open source software? I do not know the answer to that, Dana. I would expect that there probably are studies out there. I would have to do some searching myself, which you're at least as qualified as I am to discover. I think that there must be, but I have not read any myself. Lynn asks about free software for screencasting. There's one called let me Google it real quick. It's called Camtasia is the commercial one. Cam Studio, I think. Yeah, I don't know if this is open source. I think that camstudio.org. I believe that is open source screencasting. I'm not 100% sure about that. Jing is terrific. It's free, but it's not open source, and I recommend Jing highly, even though it's not open source. Priscilla, you can save files in OpenOffice in Word format, in Word doc format, and it is 100% compatible with Word as far as I've been able to see. You can set the default save in OpenOffice so that it saves to doc format, or to, excuse me, I should say to Microsoft format, because it's more than just a word processor. Steve, I prefer OpenOffice over Google Docs in some cases because, for one thing, for me the big #1 reason to use OpenOffice rather than Google Docs is Zotero. It's got a Zotero plugin. That's really my #1 reason. Google Docs is great. I use it constantly, but it's fairly basic as far as the word processing features go. So if I need to insert text boxes or if I need to do footnotes and things like that, then I'm going to go with OpenOffice or Word. Other questions? Is anyone aware of an ETA for LiveX 2.0 to come out of beta? I am not. I would have to Google that to find out. Catherine, thank you for coming, Catherine. Catherine is here from Australia, by the way, if anybody doesn't know Catherine already. You can output OpenOffice files to MediaWiki markup format too. That's awesome. I did not know that. Yeah, OpenOffice will output in all kinds of formats. It'll save as PDF. It'll save to all kinds of different formats, which is a really neat thing about it. Word will do a lot of those as well. I don't think Word will do MediaWiki markup. That is really good to know. OpenOffice, Lynn, OpenOffice does have programs that are the equivalent of PowerPoint and Excel. Yep. Have I had experience investing time and effort into using an open source program and it dies? Also, of course, as you point out, a danger with commercial products. I have not personally. I would expect that Emory folks from who have used Reserve Direct might have comments on that. I'm not aware of that many open source programs that development has just ceased on. Reserve Direct is one example of that. What sources do you recommend to stay up to date? There are so many good blogs and websites out there as far as open source is concerned, and I'm really, yeah, Lifehacker is a really great site. Just as a user of open source software, that's a great suggestion. I've not used Infomaki. Lifehacker has separate feeds just for Linux, just for software. Surge, are there websites dealing specifically with legal ramifications of open source software? Anybody got comments on that? I'm thinking of, yeah, I don't have my blog feeds in front of me. Free Software Foundation is probably a really good one, and it's, let me copy and paste. Free Software Foundation comes to mind off the top of my head. There are, I'm sure, many others out there. If you've got other suggestions, just paste them in. Off the top of my head, that's my best suggestion. Open Source Initiative, thank you, Catherine. Some of my techie librarian friends are in the room, so I think there are going to be some folks who have better suggestions than I do. Next questions? I think we have time for a few more questions. There are loads of other ones that I subscribe to that I'm just drawing a blank on the names right now. Sarah, Buffy, did we capture any more questions that I missed? Buffy, no is the short answer to Buffy's question. Working with college students, do you find they come to campus knowing about open source software or not? No. The average student that I work with has no idea what open source means. If I explain it's free, you can download and it doesn't cost anything, they pick that up real quick. But when I'm teaching Zotero, for example, which is the main open source program that I teach, I don't try to explain open source beyond just it's free. They may or may not care. Dana's asking, how do you get admin to take chances on using open source software? Like I said, my experience has been really so easy that I might not be helpful on that question. Maybe other people can comment on it. If you're willing to try it as a pilot, say I'm willing to take on the support duties for this, that's probably a good place to start off. Be very clear about what you're going to need or not need from your IT department and then stick with that. Be clear about what's going to be a success and what's going to be a failure. That's a little broad, but that's off the top of my head maybe my best general answer to that question. Courtney, hey Courtney, which of these tools should be teaching college students and faculty to use? Well, obviously I'm going to say Zotero. Zotero is just my favorite thing ever. It's the best thing since sliced bread. I advocate for using Firefox. A lot of our library applications work better with Firefox than they do with other things. Other tools that people may be using just in the course of their research and and teaching. Firefox is one. I think it's great for people to have some conversance, a little bit of competence with media production software if they're going to be using that in their teaching or in their work. So Audacity comes to mind there. LiveX is one that I think every researcher should know about. It's something that I find a lot of people don't know about. So there's my short list there. Other questions? Serge is asking, one of my non-librarian friends is asking me tough questions today. Thanks for coming, Serge. Is there any government entity actively opposing open source software? To my knowledge, no. To my knowledge, open source tools tend to be highly standards compliant. You might do better asking a programmer that question, but from what I know from my research and my use of open source tools tend to be more standards compliant and more secure because you can examine the source code and see exactly how they work. I did not know that whitehouse.gov runs on Drupal. Drupal is another open source content management system. Good advice from Cliff there. Yeah, Catherine's absolutely right about LibrariX. Sell it to librarians first. I can't recommend LibrariX highly enough. I use it all the time in collection development as well as in reference and research. I know we're close to coming up on time, and I want to give Brian time to set up for his session and so on. Moderators, do we have time for a couple more questions? I agree with Cliff. I tried setting up Drupal for my, oh, he's on at 11:15. I'm sorry, I thought he was coming on at 11. Thank you, okay. Cliff, I tried setting up Drupal on my own website, jasonpuckett.net. Does not run on Drupal. It does run on WordPress, both open source. I tried out Drupal, and it was way more than I needed for a personal website. It was interesting, and I'm interested in learning more about Drupal at some point. I've not really used it much. I know there are people who just rave about Drupal, and it's something that I want to learn more about. There are other open source content management systems out there, some that I didn't mention. Omeka, I think it's omeka.org, is another one that's produced by Center for History and New Media, the institute that makes Zotero. It's an open source content management system for mostly for digital exhibits, digital publishing of scholarly works. A lot of museums use Omeka. I didn't mention that in my presentation today. Moodle is open source, Dana. Yeah. Yeah, that's why I haven't, Amanda. That's why I haven't learned Drupal yet. I haven't had a project that I needed it for. WordPress makes WordPress is blog software primarily, but it makes a terrific, simple, easy to use, free content management system. It does not just have to be used for blogs. There are all kinds of sites out there that are built on WordPress that are not blogs. I've never heard of OpenScholar, Marie. Thank you. That's interesting. I'll just let questions and discussion come in and for a few more minutes. Is this site built with Drupal.com? I've never heard of that. That's cool. Well, if we have a lull in the questions, let me plug my podcast real briefly, if that's okay, moderators. That's the URL for Adventures in Library Instruction, which is a monthly podcast that I do with two friends about teaching information literacy. Our next episode is going to be next week. We're recording on Monday, and it'll go up early next week. We talk about technology and teaching tools and teaching techniques and so on. So take a look at that if you teach information literacy at all. Buffy's asking about apps and open source resources to watch in the next year. You know, I hate to keep saying Zotero, but Zotero is going to be releasing some really, really interesting and exciting new features coming end of this year, early next year. It's going to work with other browsers, which is a big sticking point for a lot of Zotero users. Obviously, I'm very keyed into Zotero because I teach it so much and I'm writing about it. So that's the first one that comes to mind. There's going to be a lot of new features for Zotero coming in the new year. Dana, I think you're probably more qualified than I am to comment on Android. Android is something I'm really interested in, but haven't used because I don't have a smartphone. I'm hoping Santa's going to bring me one because I've got my eye on a couple of Android phones that I would like. I don't feel qualified to comment on that, but I know that it's a lot easier to. Well, I find Android interesting because it's much more of an open platform than the the iPhone operating system is. It allows you to install third-party applications. It's much easier to jailbreak a locked Android phone than it is, I think, than it is an iPhone. Again, I think there are plenty of other people in the room who are more qualified to answer that question than I am. Dana, you're probably one of them. Yeah, Catherine, Calvin is more fond of chewing fabrics than he is hardware, fortunately for me, although he has ruined geez, at least 2 computer keyboards that I can think of. I've had to install a couple of laptop keyboards thanks to Calvin launching himself across them. Yeah, I always warn guests to my house, don't leave your sweaters out where the cat can get to it. Any more questions? Otherwise, I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you all so very much for coming. I'm really gratified by the turnout, and I hope that this has been interesting for some of you. I've learned some just from the discussion. Serge, that is a whole different question. We're working on a mobile website for our library right now. I say we, I mean Cliff and some of my other colleagues. That is a huge open question in libraries right now, and the subject for a whole other presentation that I'm not qualified to give for sure, that Cliff probably could and has. I know I've heard him talk about mobile devices in libraries. Thank you all very much. Again, Buffy, Sarah, Pat, thank you for inviting me. Tessa, thanks for the tech support in the background. Thank you all for coming. Follow up with me by email if you want to talk about this stuff further. I'm more than interested in doing that. Thanks, everybody. I'll turn the mic over now.
Okay, well, Jason, thank you so much, and I know I'm personally just blown away. I feel like I've learned so much this morning. Let's give a warm round of applause to Jason for sharing his expertise and time. And if you haven't listened to his Adventures in Library Instruction podcast, I'd highly recommend you check it out. It's a great resource for learning. At this time, we are going to take a short break. We're going to resume at 11:15 for our next session with Brian Holtze, who's going to be talking to us a little bit later this morning about e-books, digital rights management, and all things related to those hot topics with e-readers, e-books, and DRM. Even if you haven't registered for Brian's session, I'd like to encourage you to stick around, whether you're here as an individual or if we have any groups that are out there joining us today. You are more than welcome to stay for this session. Thank you again, everyone, for attending this morning, and we'll take a break, and we will resume at 11:15. Have a great day, everyone, if you're heading out.